Sarah Davis had always loved the quiet mornings. There was something about the early hours, when the world was still waking up, that made everything feel peaceful. It was the time she could truly appreciate the beauty of her life. Simple, yet fulfilling. Her house, a small farmhouse tucked away in Meadowbrook, was nestled at the edge of the forest. The trees, old and wise, stretched their arms to the sky, creating a natural wall of green around her. The surrounding land was vast, yet serene, with a wide open field where the grass swayed gently in the morning breeze. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when Sarah stepped onto her front porch, the first rays of light painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. In her hands, she cradled a steaming mug of coffee, its warmth seeping into her skin, calming her mind. Sarah breathed in the fresh air, savoring the scent of pine trees and the distant fragrance of wood smoke from nearby homes. It was her favorite part of the day, the calm before the world fully awoke. As Sarah stood there, she took a moment to reflect on her past. Her eyes scanned the landscape, but her mind was elsewhere, back in the days when she had been a soldier. The memories were sharp, like flashes of light, training in combat zones, running high-stakes missions, and always being prepared for the worst. For over 30 years, Sarah had been in charge of training military dogs for specialized operations, working with her trusted companions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. She had seen things, experienced things, that most people would never comprehend. But now, that part of her life was over. Sarah's fingers tightened around the mug, the comforting warmth reminding her of the strength she had carried with her all these years. It was a strength born from experience, a strength she never let go of, even in retirement. Beside her, her two German shepherds, Hunter and Luna, moved in unison, patrolling the perimeter of the property. Their movements were fluid, precise, and calculated. Even after 3 years of retirement, they had not forgotten the discipline that had been instilled in them. Their eyes were sharp, scanning the area around them for any potential threat, just as they had been trained to do. It was second nature to them. Sarah smiled as she watched Hunter pause for a moment. His ears perked up, listening intently. He was always the more alert one, the one who could sense danger before it even appeared. After a few moments, he continued his patrol, his tail held high and his posture perfect. Sarah could see the same vigilance in Luna, who was moving along the far side of the property, her head low, eyes focused. They were her partners, more than just pets. These dogs had saved lives, and in turn, they had earned Sarah's unwavering loyalty. As Sarah made her way back to the house, she turned to look at her dogs once more, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. Even in retirement, they still acted like soldiers, always on duty, always ready. It was a bond that went beyond training. They were family. After she finished her coffee, Sarah loaded her dogs into her modified pickup truck. It was a well-equipped vehicle, designed for ease of access to the dog's equipment and tactical gear, though she preferred to keep it all hidden when she wasn't actively on duty. The dog's tactical vests lay neatly folded in a compartment, waiting for any situation that might require them. But today was a quiet day, and she wasn't planning on anything more than a visit to McCarthy's diner for a meal with her old friend Lily. The drive into town was always peaceful. The road wound through thick forests, trees standing like silent sentinels on either side. Sarah had driven this road countless times over the years, but it never lost its charm. It reminded her of the simplicity she had always longed for, a life away from the chaos of the battlefield, where things were quieter, slower. McCarthy's Diner, a local favorite, sat at the corner of Main and Maple Streets. Its warm glow stood in contrast to the coolness of the early morning, the scent of frying bacon and fresh brewed coffee inviting passers-by to stop in for a bite. When Sarah entered, she was greeted with a smile from Lily, the diner's owner, who was already reaching for the coffee pot. "Right on time. As always, Sarah," Lily said, pouring a fresh cup for her friend. Sarah smiled, taking her usual seat by the window, where she could keep an eye on both the entrance and the back door. Old habits never died, especially for someone like Sarah. Even in a quiet town like Meadowbrook, she had learned to remain vigilant, always aware of her surroundings. "Thanks, Lily," Sarah replied as she settled into her booth. Her eyes briefly flickered outside, where Hunter and Luna sat in the truck, alert as ever. She couldn't help but feel reassured by their presence. They were her silent protectors, even in a place like this. "Business is good, then?" Sarah asked as Lily poured herself a cup of coffee and slid into the seat across from her. Lily shrugged. "Can't complain. Though I've been hearing talk about some bikers passing through lately, making people a little nervous." She leaned closer, her voice lowering. "A group calling themselves the Thunder Riders. They don't look like the type to be just passing through." Sarah's gaze shifted to the window, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had heard of biker gangs before, and their presence always brought trouble. But for now, she remained silent, her mind already beginning to analyze the situation. As she sipped her coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change in this quiet town, and it wasn't going to be in a way anyone expected. The sound of revving engines cut through the morning silence like a jagged edge, its deep rumble growing louder as the motorcycles approached the diner. Sarah's gaze shifted toward the window, where she caught sight of 3 bikes pulling into the parking lot. The riders, clad in black leather with patches on their jackets, didn't look like the typical travelers passing through town. The Thunder Riders, as Lily had called them, were here with intent, and Sarah had a sinking feeling in her gut that the peace of Meadowbrook was about to be disturbed. As the motorcycles came to a halt, the bike's engines sputtered and died, leaving an eerie stillness in the air for a brief moment. Sarah watched as the riders dismounted. The leader was a tall man with a scruffy beard and an air of arrogance that immediately made him stand out. His cut displayed a patch with the words Thunder Riders MC emblazoned in bold letters, a sign of his authority within the group. He was flanked by 2 others, both equally imposing with their black leather vests and dark sunglasses. They didn't look like men who came in peace. The bell above the diner door jingled loudly as they entered, their heavy footsteps pounding on the wooden floors. The atmosphere shifted at once. The usual hum of the diner, the sizzling of bacon and eggs, the clinking of cutlery, fell away as the bikers made their presence known. The air was thick with tension as their eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on Lily, who was still standing behind the counter. When their gaze moved towards Sarah, a slight smirk spread across the leader's face, his eyes locking onto her with an unsettling curiosity. Well, what do we have here?" the leader said, his voice low and thick with condescension. He sauntered over to Sarah's booth, the other 2 bikers following in his wake. "Didn't know this place was a retirement home," he added with a mocking chuckle. Sarah's posture remained unchanged. She didn't flinch, didn't react. She simply took another sip of her coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle in her chest. The 2 dogs were still in the truck, but she didn't need them yet. Her instincts told her this was a test, and she had been trained for situations like this. Her calm demeanor was her first line of defense. The leader slid into the booth across from Sarah, his body language smug and intimidating. His companions spread out behind him, one leaning against the counter, arms crossed, the other standing by the back door, blocking the way. They weren't here to just have a coffee. They were staking their claim, trying to intimidate Sarah and anyone else in the diner. "I'm Rogue," the leader said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "And these are my brothers. We're just here to introduce ourselves. Let the good folks of Meadowbrook know that we'll be around a lot more in the future." His eyes glinted with something darker behind them, a predatory edge that Sarah didn't miss. Sarah's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. She set her coffee cup down carefully, her fingers brushing lightly over the handle. "Is that so?" she replied evenly, her voice calm and collected. "I've been coming here for years. Haven't seen you around before." Rogue's smile didn't reach his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, his posture aggressive, but Sarah didn't budge. "Things are changing in this town, "Old lady," he said, his voice lowering just enough to carry a hint of threat. "And maybe it's time for the old guard to step aside and make room for progress." Sarah's mind was already working, analyzing every movement, every word. There was more to these men than their tough talk and leather jackets. They weren't just passing through. They were here to take something. And she wasn't about to let that happen. Outside, Hunter and Luna remained still in the truck, watching. Sarah knew they would stay exactly where she left them until given the command. But it wasn't time yet. She didn't need them to handle these men. She could do this herself. Rogue leaned back in the booth, the confidence in his posture never wavering. "You've been through a lot, haven't you? But you're not in charge anymore. This town needs new leadership, and we're here to make sure that happens." He motioned to his men. "We're just getting started, and this place." He gestured vaguely around the diner. "Could use a new direction. A little shake-up." Sarah's eyes flickered to the window, where Hunter's alert gaze met hers. Then she returned her attention to Rogue, her expression unreadable. "I think you misunderstand something," she said, her voice now carrying the weight of years of experience. "You may have the numbers, but you don't have the whole picture." Rogue's smirk faltered for a moment, his confidence slipping just slightly as he processed her words. Something in her tone made him pause. He was used to pushing people around, getting his way. But this woman, this old lady, wasn't scared. She wasn't backing down. Outside, the faint rustle of wind whispered through the trees, but in the diner, the silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft clink of a coffee cup as Sarah carefully placed it back on the table. Her hand rested lightly on the edge, a subtle but deliberate gesture of control. "Funny thing about threats," Sarah continued, her voice low, almost soothing. "The real ones don't announce themselves. They don't walk in with leather cuts and flashy attitudes. They wait. They observe. They're calculated." Rogue's eyes narrowed as he leaned back, his earlier arrogance now tempered by a flicker of unease. He wasn't used to people who didn't back down, and Sarah's calm demeanor was starting to unnerve him. "You're threatening me now, old lady?" he asked, his voice hardening. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that said she knew something he didn't. "No," she replied. "I'm just letting you know that you've made a mistake. You thought you found an easy target, but you're not seeing the whole picture." The temperature in the diner seemed to drop, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Sarah could feel it now. This wasn't just an idle threat. These men had come to intimidate, to scare, and if she didn't act, they would escalate. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced much worse, and she knew how to handle this. Outside, Hunter's ears pricked up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Sarah's eyes flicked toward the window, catching his gaze. Then, with a subtle shift of her body, she stood up from the booth, her hand brushing against the small, hidden compartment in her jacket where her backup was waiting. She had made her point. And now, it was time to let Rogue and his gang know just how badly they had miscalculated. Before she could make a move, the diner door swung open again, and Sarah's old friend, Sheriff Ben Hayes, walked in, his presence a reassuring sight. He took in the scene with professional detachment, his eyes flicking briefly to Sarah and then to the bikers. His hand rested casually near his weapon, but there was no sign of tension in his stance. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to end it. Well, looks like we've got ourselves a little party," Sheriff Hayes said, his tone easy, but his eyes were sharp as they settled on Rogue. "Is there a problem here?" Rogue stood up, his eyes flashing as he turned to face the sheriff. But for the first time, there was uncertainty in his posture. He hadn't expected the law to show up, and now he realized that his plans were falling apart. The quiet town of Meadowbrook wasn't as easy a target as he had thought. "No problem, Sheriff," Rogue said with forced confidence. "Just a little chat. We were leaving anyway." Sheriff Hayes didn't respond right away. He just nodded, his gaze steady. "Good idea. You should head out now before things get worse." As the bikers reluctantly filed out of the diner, their bikes roaring to life in the parking lot. Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but she knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Rogue and his gang had shown their hand, and now Sarah was going to make sure they didn't get the chance to play their game in Meadowbrook. This was her town, and no one, not even the Thunder Riders, was going to take it from her. The tension that had simmered in the diner now erupted into something palpable. As the last of the bikers walked out, Sarah could feel the weight of the moment press against her chest. The quiet of Meadowbrook had been shattered, and she knew that Rogue and his gang wouldn't be satisfied with just a warning. They had been testing the waters, seeing if they could scare people into submission. But Sarah wasn't the kind of person who would bow to intimidation. She had been in situations far worse than this, and she had always come out on top. As the bikers' motorcycles roared down the road, fading into the distance, Sarah's eyes never left the window. She could sense the storm was only beginning. The sheriff had given them a chance to retreat, but Sarah knew this was just a temporary lull in the battle. The bikers had come with a purpose, and now they knew that the quiet, retired woman they had underestimated was a force to be reckoned with. It was only a matter of time before they returned, and when they did, they would come harder. Hunter and Luna remained in the truck, perfectly still but alert, their training never faltering. Sarah could almost hear them breathing in sync, waiting for her next command. She could feel the connection with them, unspoken, but always there. They were more than just dogs to her. They were partners, soldiers in their own right, and when the time came, they would act with precision, just as they always had. As Sarah took her seat once more at the booth, Lily came over, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What do you think?" Lily asked quietly, her eyes filled with concern. Sarah leaned back in the booth, her fingers tapping on the edge of her coffee cup. "They'll be back," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And next time, it won't be just a chat. They'll try to make a move." She didn't need to elaborate. Lily could see it in her eyes. Sarah had dealt with situations like this before. She knew how to read people, and the biker's behavior had set off all her alarms. Lily nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "What should we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing yet," Sarah replied, her eyes narrowing as she watched the road through the window. "We wait for them to make their move. We don't go looking for trouble, but we don't run from it either." The minutes stretched into an uncomfortable silence. The diner, which had been bustling with the usual morning crowd, now felt deserted. The stillness was unsettling, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. Sarah knew this wasn't just about her anymore. The bikers had come to take control of Meadowbrook, and it was up to her to stop them before they did any real damage. It wasn't long before the rumble of engines returned, this time louder and more insistent. Sarah didn't need to look out the window to know that the bikers were back. The sound of the motorcycles reached her ears first, and then she saw the reflection in the diner's window. 3 bikes pulling into the parking lot again. This time, however, there was something different about the way they rode. The engines roared louder, the riders' movements more deliberate, as if they were preparing for something. Sarah stood up slowly, her hand resting on the table as she gathered her thoughts. She felt the familiar weight of her tactical vest under her jacket, the reassuring presence of the equipment she had carried with her for years. She had prepared for moments like this, and now it was time to put that training to use. Her dogs, Hunter and Luna, were ready. They had trained for situations like this too. They were her first line of defense, and she trusted them implicitly. Outside, the bikers dismounted with more urgency this time, their steps heavy with purpose. Rogue was leading the charge again, but there was a new energy in the air. He wasn't here to intimidate anymore. He was here to take control. His eyes scanned the diner, searching for any signs of weakness, but he didn't find any. He found Sarah sitting calmly in her booth, a smile playing at the corner of her lips. He hadn't expected that. He had thought he could scare her off with a few threats, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. Rogue approached the booth once more, his face set in a hard line. "You didn't take me seriously before," he said, his voice low and threatening. "But you will now." His eyes flicked to the window, where Hunter and Luna sat, their gaze unblinking, locked on the bikers. The dogs knew this was no longer a game. They were about to spring into action, and there was no turning back. Sarah didn't flinch. She simply smiled, her gaze meeting Rogue's. "You don't seem to understand," she said calmly. "You may have the numbers, but you don't have control. You've made a mistake, and I'm the one who's going to correct it." Rogue's expression faltered, just for a second, but it was enough to show that the doubt was creeping in. He had underestimated Sarah before, but now he realized that she was a different kind of woman. She wasn't afraid of him or his gang. She wasn't intimidated by his threats. She was a force to be reckoned with, and it was too late for him to back down. "Last chance," Rogue growled, his hand hovering near the knife he kept tucked in his belt. "Move out of our way, and we'll let you live. But if you don't..." He trailed off, but the threat was clear. Sarah didn't even blink. "You don't scare me," she said quietly. "You're out of your depth, and you don't even realize it." With that, the air in the diner shifted. It was no longer a conversation. It was a standoff. Rogue's hand moved quickly toward his vest, but before he could make a move, a low growl filled the air. Luna was the first to react, her growl low and menacing, a sound that sent chills down the spines of the bikers. Hunter followed suit, his posture rigid, his muscles coiled and ready to spring into action at Sarah's command. Rogue froze, his hand still hovering near his weapon. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the dogs to be the real threat. But now he saw it in their eyes. These weren't just pets. These were military-trained dogs, and they were ready to fight. The moment of tension stretched on, and then it happened. Sarah gave a subtle nod, and in an instant, the dogs were moving. Hunter was on the first biker before he could even draw his knife, pinning him to the ground with a swift, controlled attack. Luna was right behind him, taking down the second biker with the same precision. The third biker, realizing that his companions were already neutralized, turned to run, but he didn't get far before Sarah's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Stay," she ordered, and with that, Luna immediately cut off the escape route, her body a wall of muscle and training. The last biker had nowhere to go. He froze, caught between Sarah's unflinching gaze and the deadly dogs that surrounded him. Rogue stood there, his face contorting in disbelief as he watched his gang crumble in seconds. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected an easy target, a town that would cower under his presence. But instead, he had walked into the wrong situation. Sheriff Ben Hayes entered the diner just as the last of the bikers was being subdued. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene with a practiced calmness. "I'd say you've got this under control," he said, his tone even. He didn't need to ask what had happened. It was clear. Sarah nodded, her smile tight but confident. "Just making sure they understand they're not welcome here." The bikers, now subdued and unable to move, were quickly escorted out of the diner, their heads hung low. As they left, the air in the diner slowly returned to its usual calm. But Sarah knew this wasn't the end. Rogue and his gang would be back, and next time, she would be ready for them. The quiet aftermath of the confrontation lingered in the diner, but Sarah knew that the bikers' retreat was just a brief respite, not the end of the battle. The Thunder Riders hadn't been scared off by her dogs or by the sheriff's presence. They were calculating, and this was far from over. As the last of the bikers disappeared down the road, Sarah remained at her booth, her fingers drumming thoughtfully on the edge of her coffee cup. Her mind was already working through the next steps, analyzing every movement, every word exchanged. Sheriff Ben Hayes stood beside her, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low but appreciative. "But I don't think they're done. We might have bought some time, but I'm sure those boys have a bigger plan." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving the window, where she could still see the dust rising in the distance from the bikers' retreating motorcycles. "They'll be back," she said calmly, her voice tinged with certainty. "And when they return, it won't be for a simple confrontation. They've already made their move." Sheriff Hayes leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What do you think they're really after? It's not just intimidation. There's something else going on." Sarah's gaze sharpened. She had spent decades in war zones, dealing with real threats, and this felt no different. The bikers weren't here to simply shake down a few businesses for money. This was part of something larger. The way Rogue and his gang moved, the subtle threats, and the careful posturing. It was all part of a bigger plan, one that she was determined to uncover. "Whatever it is, it's bigger than just these men," Sarah said, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet intensity. "They're working for someone. And I think I know who." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You have someone in mind?" Sarah leaned back in the booth, her mind racing. The bikers' behavior hadn't been random. They were too organized, too disciplined for simple thugs, and the name that had been on the tip of her tongue all morning finally clicked. The Dark Wolves. A name whispered in the shadows, a criminal syndicate that had been quietly infiltrating small towns across the region. It wasn't just about illegal activities like drug trafficking or extortion. The Dark Wolves were known for their connections to larger, more dangerous groups. "I think it's time to get some answers," Sarah said, standing up from the booth. She wasn't about to wait for things to escalate any further. She had dealt with criminal organizations before, and she knew exactly how to dismantle them, one piece at a time. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he nodded, already understanding the gravity of what Sarah was suggesting. "I'll call in some backup," he said, already reaching for his phone. "You're sure about this?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "I've spent my life training military dogs to take down threats. This isn't any different. We've got the advantage of surprise, and if we move fast, we can put an end to this before they even realize what's happening." The two of them left the diner and headed toward Sarah's truck, where Hunter and Luna were still sitting, their eyes alert as they sensed the change in Sarah's energy. The dogs could feel the tension building, and they knew that this was more than just a morning walk. Sarah had already made up her mind. She was going to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As they drove through Meadowbrook, Sarah's mind ran through everything she knew about the Dark Wolves. Their criminal empire had been built on a foundation of fear and intimidation, but they weren't just small-time criminals. They had connections that ran deep, reaching into every corner of the country. The bikers were just pawns in a much larger game, and it was time to expose the players behind the scenes. The truck rumbled down the familiar roads, but this time, Sarah was looking for more than just a peaceful morning. She was looking for signs, for clues that would lead her to the heart of the operation. The Dark Wolves had been operating in the shadows for too long, but now it was her turn to bring them into the light. They arrived at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that had always been used for storage and deliveries. It was nondescript, the kind of building that didn't attract attention. But Sarah knew better. This was where the Dark Wolves were hiding their operations, where they moved their illicit goods and coordinated their next move. She parked the truck a distance away, keeping her headlights off and the engine running quietly. Hunter and Luna were already at attention, their muscles tensed, ready to move. Sarah could feel the pulse of the mission in her veins, a familiar rush of adrenaline as she opened the truck door and signaled for the dogs to follow. They moved silently, their footsteps barely a whisper on the pavement. Sarah kept her hand close to her sidearm, her senses sharp as she approached the warehouse. Inside, she could hear the low hum of voices, the sound of people talking in hushed tones, probably unaware of the danger that was creeping closer. Through a crack in the door, Sarah peeked inside. There were several men in the warehouse, their faces obscured by shadows, but she recognized the familiar swagger of the bikers. They were unloading crates from a truck, each one stamped with a symbol she knew all too well, the mark of the Dark Wolves. It wasn't just drugs. They were moving something far more dangerous. Sarah's heart rate quickened as she realized they were transporting weapons, military-grade explosives and ammunition. She signaled to Hunter and Luna, who were already in position, their eyes trained on the men inside. They were ready to act at a moment's notice. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. If she didn't act now, the Dark Wolves would be able to carry out their plans without interference. She made a split-second decision. "Go," she whispered, and the dogs moved like shadows, their training allowing them to move undetected. Hunter darted toward the first group of men, his movements swift and silent, while Luna covered the other side of the warehouse, keeping watch over the second group. In an instant, the bikers were down, taken by surprise. Sarah moved in, her eyes scanning the scene for any more threats. She could hear the men inside shouting, realizing too late that they had been caught off guard. But Sarah didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, her military training guiding her every step, as she secured the area and radioed for backup. As the sheriff and his team arrived, they took control of the scene, arresting the remaining men and confiscating the weapons. Sarah stood back, watching as the operation was dismantled piece by piece. The Dark Wolves had underestimated her, thinking they could operate without resistance in a small town like Meadowbrook, but they had made a mistake. Sarah had spent her life tracking down the kind of people who thought they could get away with murder and crime. And now, they were going to face the consequences. As the authorities processed the evidence and took the criminals into custody, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The truth had been unveiled. The Dark Wolves were no longer a shadow in the corner of the town. They had been exposed, their plans foiled, and their grip on Meadowbrook broken. Hunter and Luna stood beside her, their heads held high, their training complete. Sarah didn't need to say anything. The bond between them was unspoken, but as they stood there together, she knew this was just another victory in a long line of battles. And no matter what came next, they would face it together.